Today, television is an integral part of the lives of most of us, bringing into our homes information and entertainment in endless variety. In the programs put out by the BBC television service, there's something for everybody. Comedy, drama, music, sport, or the news. The news is one of the most widely viewed items in the day's program. Events of international importance, and some of rather less importance, but no less interest, are collated, edited, and broadcast in sound and vision to keep you fully informed of up-to-the-minute happenings in the world around us.
Right. Cue caption scanner. Cue tape. Standby 1. Fade up 1. Fade down scanner.
Here is the news. There have been several political developments closely affecting Western Germany in London, Washington, and Bonn.
Sometimes the seemingly less important news items are overshadowed by world events and lose some of their impact by their essential brevity. Take the next news item, for example.
Television viewers in the south of England will have improved viewing, and the signal will have an extended range, for as from today there comes into operation the new television tower at Crystal Palace.
The Crystal Palace and the new television tower. This simple announcement begins the story of a tower that rose like the legendary phoenix from the ashes of its own past. The Crystal Palace was a highlight in the history of the mid-Victorian period and had a very positive effect on art, commerce, and popular entertainment in its time. It all began with a scheme fostered by Albert Prince Consort to hold a great exhibition of all nations in London in the year 1851. At first, the idea was unpopular with many eminent politicians, but Albert and his supporters fought the opposition and won. In due course, a colossal exhibition hall of glass was built in Hyde Park. The original design, rather like a vast conservatory, evolved from a blotting paper sketch made by Sir Joseph Paxton, an expert in the use of glass in construction work. Prefabricated iron sections were used to support the glass, and the work was completed within a few months. By any standards, the building was a remarkable piece of engineering, and in 1851, it seemed almost a miracle. Paxton had vision. Modern designers have referred to this building as one of the first successful examples of functionalism in architectural design. After the great exhibition was over, the structure was taken to pieces, considerably enlarged, and re-erected on the highest ridge of the Sydenham Hills. And so the Crystal Palace became nationally famous and one of London's most notable landmarks. But times change, and popular taste in entertainment changes with the times. By the early 1930s, the palace had lost much of its popularity. New forms of entertainment had sprung up, and about this time, a new word was coined: television. A pair of water towers, 280 feet high, had been added soon after the palace was re-erected at Sydenham. On one of these towers, experimental television aerials appeared. In this way, the Crystal Palace, center of popular entertainment and education for more than 80 years, became the center of early experiments with a brand new medium of expression. But not for long. One evening in November 1936, the building was totally destroyed by fire. The association of the Crystal Palace with television was over for many years to come. 18 years after the fire, the site was still derelict. The deserted gardens remained a clutter of broken stonework, dismantled railings, and weed-grown subways. And all that remained of the North Tower was the creeper-covered brickwork of its foundations. Ironically, Alexandra Palace, built as a rival center of entertainment to the Crystal Palace, became the headquarters of BBC television in London, and until 1956, all transmissions broadcast over London and the southeast went out from these aerials. In 1946, the station at Alexandra Palace had recommenced transmissions, and the BBC started on its plan to extend the television service to other parts of the country. A very large area of the Midlands was to be covered from the first of the new high-power transmitters at Sutton Coldfield, near Birmingham. With the completion of the BBC's second high-power station at Home Moss, near Huddersfield, some of the northern counties were to be linked with the Midlands and the south. Next, a large area of the lowlands of Scotland was to be included, followed by most of South Wales and part of the West Country. Then transmitters were to be brought into operation in Northern Ireland, the Isle of Man, and Northumberland. Progressively, the BBC was to proceed with its plans for complete coverage from Scotland to the Channel Isles and from the east coast of England to Northern Ireland. The most powerful transmitter was to be set up within the London area to replace Alexandra Palace. The aerials for this new transmitter were to be about 1,000 feet above sea level. This stylized drawing illustrates the principle. Very high-frequency radio waves are transmitted rather like beams of light. The range of reception is virtually the visual horizon as seen from the aerials. Therefore, the higher the aerials can be raised above ground level, the greater will be the transmission range. Soon after the war, the masts began to go up. The 750-foot mast at Sutton Coldfield, serving the Midlands, was a stayed mast of triangular steel section. The next triangular section mast was built on high ground at Home Moss to serve a wide area of the north of England. Other masts throughout the country were to be similar in construction. But the aerials at Alexandra Palace were only 600 feet above sea level. To give increased range, a taller tower was needed, and a new site had to be found near London. Eventually, the engineers chose an ideal site, the very spot where the old Crystal Palace had stood for over 80 years. And so it was decided that the BBC's new London transmitter should be built on top of the long ridge of the Sydenham Hills. As soon as the site had been chosen, work began on the design of the new tower. At other BBC transmitters, stayed masts had been used. But site restrictions precluded the use of a mast at Crystal Palace, and it was therefore necessary to build a self-supporting tower. This form of construction is more aesthetically pleasing, an important consideration for such a landmark so near London, and the design received the approval of the Royal Fine Art Commission. As the design calculation progressed, more and more work had to be done in the drawing office, preparing detailed drawings for the whole tower. At this stage, tests were carried out by the National Physical Laboratory and by the Imperial College to determine the aerodynamic stability of the tower. For the purpose of tests, scaled sections of each of the aerial carrying parts of the tower were made. These sections were subjected to extensive tests in the wind tunnel. The airstream in the wind tunnel caused the models to vibrate, and in this way, knowledge of the behavior of the structure under various wind conditions was obtained. Now, with the site cleared, the work of construction began. First, the area had to be accurately surveyed and marked out. Construction plants began to arrive on site. Work had already started on the lower terrace, where the new underground transmitter building to house the electronic equipment was going up. Piles had to be driven to support each of the 4 legs of the tower, but because the transmitter building was being constructed close to and below the site, vibration had to be minimized. This factor was taken into account in deciding the method of piling to be used. The 4 concrete foundation blocks were to be set 120 feet apart. Each leg was to be supported by 6 vertical and 3 raking piles capped by reinforced concrete. These concrete pads were to be 14 feet square and 4 feet thick. The piles would have to be driven to an adequate depth to support solidly the 4 splayed legs carrying the immense weight of the completed tower. Below ground, the piles would look like this. In driving each pile, the concrete shoe attached to the mandrel forces its way into the ground, and shells are fitted one above the other as driving progresses. Each blow of the hammer sinks the assembly deeper into the ground. The ground below this site is formed of London clay. The construction engineers decided that the pile should be driven to a predetermined depth where the clay becomes stiffer and more resistant. When each pile reaches the required depth, a steel reinforcement cage is dropped in, and the shells are filled with concrete, forming an unstressed solid core. While the work of piling was being done on the site, a great deal of important work for the tower was going on more than 100 miles from London at the works of another member of the BICC group. The whole of the steelwork for the Crystal Palace Tower was fabricated at this extensive factory in the city of Hereford, where they specialize in the production of lattice towers and masts and of unusual structures such as the new tower. This factory isn't at all the dirty place you'd expect a steelworks to be. 35 years' experience has proved that only under such ideal conditions is it possible to attain the high standard of workmanship necessary for erection on site to proceed smoothly. The work done in the factory is checked in the black, that is, before the metal is galvanized. Here, one complete leg section has been assembled on the ground so that inspectors can check it from end to end before it goes along to be galvanized. Every section of the tower was put together for checking in the same way. Back on site, the work of piling was being finished off. Some of the century-old foundation work of the Crystal Palace was discovered when the site was being prepared. Piles were to be driven here, so this area would have to be filled in and made good. Steel grillages fitted with heavy-gauge bolts to hold the base plates in position had to be emplaced and concreted within the 14-foot pile caps. With its grillage emplaced, each pile cap was to be built up with reinforced concrete. Great care had to be taken to avoid throwing the base plate bolts out of position. Foundation work continued during the winter months. The work went on in some of the worst weather of the year. Only the most extreme conditions of frost and snow slowed down progress on the site during that first winter. By the end of the winter, the site had been prepared for construction above ground level. A number of temporary concrete blocks had been emplaced, ready for guy ropes to be attached. In the center of the site, a derrick 230 feet high was erected. This derrick was built up of 20-foot welded sections, and 2 derrick poles were temporarily attached to the top. Each section was winched up to be manhandled into position and bolted on. By now, the construction team were ready for the base plates. Each leg of the tower was to depend upon one of these thick steel base plates for its strength, and their production involved a good deal of specialized study at Hereford. When the component parts had been cut to shape and hold, they were rigidly mounted in a jig for welding. The jig can be revolved in order that the operator can deal with every joint in turn and work at any angle that is most convenient and efficient. As soon as it has cooled off, the base plate is shot blasted to remove weld slag and taken straight into the galvanizing shop, where it has to be properly cleaned in acid, or pickled as they call it, before galvanizing. Galvanizing is simply coating steel with pure zinc, and to do this, the work is immersed in a bath of molten metal. But the protective coat you get by doing this is different from a coat of paint. Broadly speaking, molten zinc and steel act together, and the final covering is a layer of zinc firmly bonded to the steel base by an amalgamation of the two metals. The base plate is left in the bath for some minutes, and the surface is cleared of oxides to avoid contamination of the work. When the expert who controls the operation decides it's ready, the base plate comes right out and is drained. The high standard of accuracy insisted on at the factory ensured that the base plates fitted perfectly on their bolts at site. When the 4 base plates were in position, an important phase in the work of construction had been completed, and everything was now ready for the erection of the lower panel to a height of just over 80 feet. Already, the angle steel for the main leg sections had begun to arrive at the local rail depot. On site, the metal was being sorted and stacked. Many hundreds of small plates and shaped sections were needed for the job, and thousands of nuts and bolts and washers. The fabrication of steelwork for the body of the tower had been going on for several months. At Hereford, the special high tensile steel came into the stockyards from the rolling mills in increasing quantities. After it had been checked and inspected, it was fed into the production shops where the cranes, driven by girl operators, were ready to take over. But long before the steel left the rolling mills, the template makers set to work drawing down the tower full size from the designer's details. Wooden templates were made for every piece. These templates are a special type of pattern carrying full instructions for marking off and used by men in the fabricating shop. One of the markers off checks the details. He then scribes the bar for length and after writing up the instructions in chalk, sends it across to the saw. Slowly but surely, this powerful machine cuts its way through the metal. After the members have been cut to length, the bolt holes have to be put in them. With the lighter bars, the operator presses the treadle with his foot and the holes are punched out cleanly in one stroke. Because they are much thicker, the heavier bars have to be drilled. This leg section member is nearly an inch thick and weighs over half a ton. The operator is drilling a pilot hole to fit a jig set on the bar. All the important drilling is done through steel jigs, which are made in the tool room by skilled craftsmen. These jigs take the place of the wooden templates and have holes of the right size at exactly the right spacing through which the drill actually passes. Each jig is inspected and tested before being passed for service. To use a jig set, the operator pegs it into the pilot hole already made and runs the bolt holes in exactly where they are required. Cut, holed and stamped with their identification numbers, the bars go into the galvanizing shop for pickling and dipping. The longest bars of all were used for these main members, but some of them were too long to go in all at once and had to be dipped in two operations, first one end and then the other. Covering up the join needs experience and skill, for there must be no unevenness in the final coating. The skimming hands repeatedly boil up the molten metal with their paddles to give a washing effect on the bar. Also, they clear away the zinc ash, which continually forms on the surface of the bath. As with the base plates, the lifting operation is carefully controlled when the time comes to take the bar out of the pot. When each bar is laid out on the trestles alongside to cool, it's carefully inspected for blemishes or faults. For the construction of the Crystal Palace Tower, 450 tons of steel were fabricated in this factory, and for many months, load after load was transported by road and rail from Hereford to the site in London. The heaviest sections to be handled on site were the leg members. These consisted of 4 angles bolted together, making a cruciform shape. This shape added strength to the structure and made the best possible use of the standard heavy angle steel sections. The beginning of steelwork erection is always a critical period for the construction engineers. Close liaison between the designer and site staff is of the utmost importance. The method of erection of the bottom panel was now fully discussed. In the first few weeks, all the detailed planning and the accuracy of the steel fabrication will be put to the test. On site, the first main member of leg number 1 was lowered onto the base plate. Some of the bracing members were partially assembled on the ground before being hoisted into position. Progress was constantly watched by the design and construction experts. Many months of planning and paperwork now began to take tangible form. A complete span section was assembled on the ground and taken up to bridge the gap between the first 2 80-foot leg members. A 125-foot derrick was used to hoist this large assembly into position. This derrick was afterwards to be used as a floating derrick. From now on, the men of the construction team spent most of their working days aloft and getting higher as the days went by. When all 4 legs were standing up, the most difficult job on the lower panel had to be tackled, the bridging of the last gap between the leg sections. The span was already assembled, ready for hoisting. The designer and the site engineer had to go through the detailed drawings and discuss the closing of the gap. Up went the assembled span, carefully steadied and guided by the men on the ground. Bridging the last gap of the first panel was a critical operation, and its final success proved that the foundations had been set out with the utmost precision. Again, the detailed drawings had to be checked in preparation for the next stage of construction. The first panel of the tower was complete to a height of 80 feet. Now, to enable the second panel to be erected, the 125-foot derrick was floated on steel ropes high enough to enable it to be used for hoisting the steelwork above the lower panel. From this stage, the 125-foot floating derrick was used for all construction work until the 440-foot level was reached, when a 45-foot floating derrick was to take over. The second and third panels were to be erected on similar lines to the first panel. In each case, the main leg was fixed into position, followed by the bracings, until a whole corner of the tower was complete. Temporary steel wire ropes held each corner until all four were connected together. Every section fitted perfectly within the framework of the structure. This was due to the extreme care taken by the steel fabricators during manufacture. In effect, the work on site became a daily routine job. Assembling various sections on the ground, preparing them for lifting, hoisting them to the required height, and bolting them into position. By now, the periphery platform at the 150-foot level had been completed. The tower had reached a height at which the 230-foot derrick could no longer be used, and so it was dismantled and taken away from the site. Even at heights like these, the construction team work as unconcernedly as they did when the first leg member went up. The tower is similar in shape to the Eiffel Tower, up to 440 feet. All the way up to that level, cruciform angle steel was used for the main leg members. This was one of the last straight cruciform sections to leave the ground. Normally, the higher the lift, the smaller are the loads handled. However, such was not the case during the erection of this tower. Loads of 3 tons were handled up to a level of 500 feet, and later, a load of 2 tons was carried right to the top of the tower. To control the dropping into position of each main leg member, whistle signals were given to the winchmen on the ground. Moving the floating derrick into position for use at these high levels was a job which had to be delicately handled. The head and base of the derrick had to be pulled over and raised by ropes attached to 8 hand winches operated from the ground. As the derrick was raised, so the tower grew. The construction team had to take advantage of every minute of good weather to tighten up the nuts and bolts in the splices of the bracing members and generally to consolidate the work already done. When the tower had grown to 400 feet, the surveyor set up his instruments on an improvised platform at the top to check the accuracy of the construction work so far completed. Construction up to the 440-foot level was now nearing completion. From this level to the top, the tower was to be built up of parallel sections designed to carry the greater part of the aerial array. At 429 feet, the design provided for first of 2 bends in the angle steel leg members. A second bend in each section at 440 feet would narrow the tower to 9 feet 6 inches square. At the first of the double bends, a platform is to be built. The main aerial carrying part of the tower is above the platform, and from this point, aerial design requirements were a main consideration in determining height and width. This level also marked the transition to rod section from angle steel. These 4 bent leg members were the last angle steel sections to arrive on site. With these sections in position, the structure would have reached 440 feet. the bent angle sections went up. But at this stage, the construction company were asked by the BBC to stop all work above the 440-foot level, pending modification in the design to make provision on the tower for additional aerials required by other services, which the BBC had undertaken to accommodate. The top part of the tower had to be redesigned completely, for roughly twice the number of aerials were now required. The designer was faced with the problem of an increase in height, without any drastic alterations to the supporting structure. Loading now became the governing factor instead of the deflection of the tower. The principal changes in design were to increase the height of the structure from 640 feet up to 708 feet. Detailed alterations to accommodate changes in the aerial array were as follows. To fix additional Band 1 aerials on the supporting structure between the 350 and 419-foot levels, to make the upper Band 1 section 72 feet in height, above this to allow for 2 sets of Band 3 aerials instead of 1 Band 1 aerial, and to fix an aerial required for the BBC's experimental transmissions in the ultra-high frequency Band 5, right at the top of the tower, bringing the overall height of the structure to 708 feet. While the top section was being redesigned, construction work on the tower continued. Above the 350-foot level, bracing members were strengthened and new platforms built. Cable trays, to support about 40 different cables, ran up on one of the legs, and the next step was to fix the additional Band 1 aerials on the supporting structure below the 400-foot level. These aerials were to be used for transmitting the BBC's programs until the Crystal Palace Tower was working at its full power. A permanent hoist was needed to convey the BBC engineers to a point from which the aerials could be serviced and maintained. This hoist was designed in such a way as to fit into the framework of the tower without spoiling its appearance. The hoist was constructed to run up to a platform just below the 400-foot level. Guide rails were fitted inside one of the legs of the tower to carry the passenger cage. An unusual feature in the design of the hoist is the way in which the cage changes direction slightly at the bend points, but still remains vertical right up to the top of its travel. In due course, the testing of the hoist was successfully completed. From the construction engineer's cradle, the tower now looked like an enormous spider's web. And now only the redesigned top section remained to be built. From the 440-foot level upwards, solid round section steel was to be used for the main legs. Lengths of 8-inch diameter, solid round, began to arrive on site, complete with gusset plates ready for erection. When these round sections were made, gusset plates with the bolt holes already in them were welded to all the leg members, not only to take the side bracings, but also to enable each length to be connected to the next one. These connecting plates were assembled in a specially designed welding jig to ensure that they were all in the right place and lying at the correct angle when finished, and also to enable the welder to operate down the length of the bar with the work always at the most suitable angle for him to produce a perfect job. On site, the final stage in the erection of the tower had begun. The first bar of the top section to be taken up was of 8-inch solid rod weighing, with its lifting tackle, over 3 tons. This first main leg was lifted within the periphery of the tower and threaded through several platform positions. Great care had to be taken throughout this operation, especially when the leg section was manhandled through the narrow aperture in the middle of the top platform. Close supervision was necessary. The site engineer and the foreman left nothing to chance. Then the erection team took up their positions at the top of the tower to receive the new steelwork. A final check was made by the foreman, and when the leg was clear of the existing steelwork, the first round section was lowered into position, ready to be bolted on. Now the tower started to grow again. The problem of continuing to build with the lower Band 1 aerials already in commission then had to be faced. All the steelwork above the 470-foot level had to be lifted outside the periphery of the tower to speed up construction. And so an unorthodox method of erection had to be evolved. At 429 feet, a special platform was constructed on which two 45-foot tubular derricks were mounted. The bonds from these two derricks were operated from two winches working at ground level. The steel was lifted up to the erection platform and then transferred to the floating derrick bond. From this level, the steel was lifted by the floating derrick, operated from a winch working on the erection platform. By now, a helicopter was needed to enable the film record of the work to be completed. At 2 points in the upper part of the tower, double bends had to be introduced into the 7-inch diameter solid round sections. Bending a steel rod of such a diameter is not easy. First, the position of the bends is marked on a bar from a wooden template before the bar is sent across to the smith's hearth to be heated. The bar is carefully tended by the blacksmith, who lets it soak in the fire until it is red hot right through. When it is ready, the bar will be swung across to the bending machine. Slowly, each bend begins to take shape as the operator brings the jaws of the press closer to the ram. These men become so experienced in this class of work that they can tell by eye when the right amount of bend has been put in. The steel template is needed only as a final check before the bar is taken away from the machine to cool off. On site once again, the work followed a normal routine. The sections were lifted off the ground and hoisted up to the erection platform. On the erection platform, the steel was transferred to the floating derrick. The steel was then taken right to the top of the tower to be dealt with by the erection team. The construction of the upper part of the tower was unusually difficult because of the necessity of using a heavy derrick in a very confined space. Weights of the main leg sections were of the order of 2 tons each, and for this work, the specially designed outriggers were extremely useful. Two 60-foot lattice derricks were assembled on the ground and taken up to deal with the topmost unit of the tower, the aerial required for the BBC's experimental transmissions in the ultra-high frequency Band 5. The two derricks were to be fixed on either side of the top of the tower to support between them the Band 5 aerial while it was being lowered into its stepping on the top platform. The Band 5 aerial is mounted on tubular steel sections, making up a total length of 40 feet. Soft copper rod is coiled about the unit for the greater part of its length. When this aerial came to be hoisted, very special care had to be taken to avoid damage to the copper coil. By now, the top of the actual structure had been reached. The addition of the Band 5 aerial would bring the tower up to its final overall height of 708 feet. And when all the constructional work had been completed, the helicopter took off to fly around the tower and bring back some unusual angles of this unique structure, the highest self-supporting tower in the British Isles. According to the usual custom among constructional engineers on such occasions, a Union Jack appeared, fluttering in the breeze from the topmost point. All that remained to be done was the installation of the aerials on the various sections of the tower. The two sections immediately below the top platform were reserved for the two sets of Band 3 aerials. upper Band 1 aerials were to be installed on this section of the tower above the main platform. And just below the main platform, the lower Band 1 aerials had been fixed and were already in use, transmitting the regular daily television programs. The work of construction had been greatly simplified by the use of a winch and derricks high up on the tower, and this lifting arrangement was also used to install the aerial arrays. Within a short time of the completion of the tower itself, some of these aerials were already installed on all 4 faces of the structure. After many years, the Crystal Palace is once more an important spot on the map. On the actual site of the old palace, the new Crystal Palace television tower has risen to broadcast entertainment and education in the modern manner. At this point, I decided to take another look at the finished job before the construction engineers left the site.
Ah, Mr. Ward. Meet Bob Denvers Walker.
How do you do, Mr.
Glad
Ward?
to meet you. Mr. Ward is in charge of our special projects department.
I would say that this certainly comes under the heading of special project.
Yes, we had a number of problems to tackle.
Oh, is that so? It's very interesting. Would you mind if I go up and record a few impressions?
Go ahead and take the hoist.
Thank you very much indeed. And so I went up with Mr. Stewart, the chief overhead construction engineer, to the terminal point of the hoist, 400 feet up. Then we climbed up to the main platform at the 440-foot level. It was well worth the effort. Even on this rather gusty day, the view from this height was remarkable. You know, to me, it feels as solid as the Rock of Gibraltar up here, but I suppose that's hardly surprising, since I'm standing on 450 tons of steel. What is surprising is that there is such a great weight of steel at the top of this slender tower. Theoretically, I'm told that if it were possible for me to sit on top of the Band 5 aerial at over 1,000 feet above sea level, I'd be able to see the coastline of Kent and Sussex.
That is perfectly true.
Down below, I can just make out the blue flag of the BBC flying over the London television station building. It's strange to think that the old Crystal Palace stood here over 100 years ago, and that experimental television broadcasts went out from this spot until the fire in 1936. No wonder that the construction of this great tower has reminded some people of the legend of the Phoenix. And the Phoenix Tower is not only an achievement in steel construction, it is also a symbol of future development.